blacks may take. And you can read about those in chapter 14. Thinking about it at the individual level, so one point to kind of take away is that prejudices and discrimination need not always align. Just because somebody's prejudiced doesn't mean they're always going to be discriminatory. Just because somebody's discriminatory doesn't mean that they have a prejudicial belief system. Make sure that you read that part of the chapter very closely, because it kind of explains the relationship between these two things and how they can work in conjunction with one another or in conflict with one another in certain circumstances. Now, this idea of individual discrimination, I think, is fairly intuitive, and it tends to be what comes to mind when most people think about discrimination. It happens when one individual discriminates against another one by denying them access to resources, access to opportunities, or by failing to recognize them and their worth in this world. And so that's kind of the common everyday way of thinking about discrimination. Institutional discrimination is less obvious, I feel like. And McIntyre gives a definition of what this is. This occurs when there is a denial of opportunities and equal rights to certain groups of people as a result of the structure of society. So many people in our society are under the impression that America today is a land of equality, or that equality reigns, that racism and sexism, for example, no longer exist. Well, research actually doesn't bear that out. One of the readings assigned for this week, the piece by Arthur, gives you some data to compare between different racial groups on a variety of measures. And when you take a look at this data, what you'll find is that by and large, certain racial groups, whites and Asians to be more specifically, tend to fare better than do other racial groups, blacks and Latinos. So when you see differences like this happening at the societal level, where some racial groups have access to more resources and more power and more opportunities, from a sociological perspective, we begin to think about that as a systemic problem. And that's when we start to refer to things such as racism. So we see these differences between racial groups not as resulting from some type of individual or cultural deficiency related to those groups, but as a result of the structure of our society. So I'm going to give you a definition of racism now. The systematic disadvantaging of minority racial groups and advantaging of dominant racial groups. In America, I'm referring to whites here. Now, institutional discrimination is obviously at the basis of this definition, but individual discrimination also plays a part here too. Whenever individual discrimination reinforces these power differences that we see happening on the societal level, we can consider that an act of racism as well. So students frequently want to ask the question, well, can people of color be racist? And from a sociological perspective, the standpoint, the answer would be no. And I know that's not going to set well with some of you, but here's kind of the reasoning behind that. While a person of color can discriminate against a white person, and that is by no means good, right? Discrimination is bad, no matter who's doing it to whoever. It's different than whenever a person of color is discriminated against, because in that moment, it's reinforcing larger patterns of inequality and privilege and marginalization that's not occurring whenever a white person encounters discrimination. Again, all acts of discrimination are bad, but they're not equal. And hopefully the reading from last week, the one that talked about false parallels, provides a little bit more insight as to why sociologists would think it important to make that distinction. Because again, what's important here is to take context, power, and history into account. Okay, so that's really all that I have this week. I want to introduce you to these topics. I want you to start thinking about these basic concepts I've covered and the ones that MacIntyre addresses in chapter 14. And then next week, we'll focus on how sociologists explain those racial disparities. So whenever I gave you the definition of racism, the systematic disadvantaging of minority racial groups, we'll unpack that a little bit more thoroughly next week. We'll look at what it means that minority racial groups are systematically disadvantaged in American society, and how it is exactly that whites are conversely systematically advantaged in American society. Okay, that's all that I have. Oh, I did want to briefly mention, a few of you in your emails have mentioned the lack of orbits in my video lectures. I assure you he is doing quite well. I guess he's just kind of been camera shy the past few weeks. I can tell you he's actually snoozing on my bed right now. So he is well. I appreciate your concern, and I'm sure that he will make at least one more appearance before the semester is out. Stay healthy and well. I will talk to you fine folks next week. Bye.